Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Tzadik Aleph in Bava Metzia. We are on 90b3 if you're following along in Art Scroll. So where are we and what are we talking about? Well, let me share my screen and we will get started. So over the last day or so, and yesterday in particular, we concluded with a discussion of the prohibition of muzzling one's animals when they engage in threshing. And noting that the prohibition applies to threshing with a muzzled animal, even if the animal was muzzled before you began threshing. So one might have thought that the prohibition is to muzzle one's animal while it is threshing, but no. The answer is that you can't. The prohibition is on threshing with a muzzled animal. Okay, so it's the slightly different emphasis, but it's a key difference. Key difference, because the point is that it seems like the idea is that we want to enable the animal to eat, and no matter how you do it, if you're preventing the animal from eating, that's going to be problematic. So now the question is, and by the way, we also learned that leading a pair of animals of different species, if you lead them together, that's going to violate the prohibition of kolayim, of mixing species, even if somebody else yoked them together. So the yoking is not the action. The action is the having them walk together, having them go together. That's going to be the problem. So if you accidentally yoke the two together and then say, oh, whoops, I didn't realize that was a horse and a donkey. I thought that was two horses. So then you can undo it and you will not have violated anything. At least that's the way it seems. Okay, so now we're going to pick up with the fifth line from the bottom of Tzadik Bet at Itmar. And so the question is, we're now going to consider whether muzzling or leading animals through one's voice alone would violate these prohibitions. And this touches on one of the very interesting topics that we have in Shas, and that is, do we say, what is our sense of whether action whether you need an action to be subject to lashes, and what's considered an action in the Torah's analysis. So let's take a look. So Itmar, again, 5 lines up, third word from the end of the line. Itmar chasama b'kol v'hinhiga b'kol. So what happens if you muzzle an animal? You basically yell at it every time it is about to eat something. So as a result, you effectively prevent it from eating by yelling at it. Or you lead it along, you convince it to go. You go, 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 etc. And finally, the two animals of different species get moved along. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayev. Rabbi Yochanan says you're liable. Reish Lakish Amar Pater. Reish Lakish says you're not. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayev Akimas Piv Havyamaisa. So Rabbi Yochanan says that the movement of one's mouth is considered an action, and so as a result, that action is sufficient to make you liable for lashes. Your voice is not considered an action, and so as a result, that's the story. Now, Tosos here asks a great question. So let's take a look at the Tosos. It's the second to last Tosos on the daf. And we'll just do the beginning part of it. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv Akimas Vasav Habi Maisa, that Rabbi Yochanan says you're liable because the movement of your mouth constitutes some kind of action. Tema, this is a complete wonder. The Parak Gimel de Shvuas, in the third chapter of Masechah Shvuas, Daf Kaf Aleph Amud Aleph, Rabbi Yochanan Omer Haya Rabbi Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Kol Lav She'ein Bo Maisa, that any action, any prohibition that does not involve an action, Ein Lokan Alav, one does not get lashes. But there are 3 exceptions. Chutz min Nishba, if you make an oath, if you vow an oath and it's a false oath, you're going to be liable for lashes. Umeimar, that's where you speak out and you say that instead of this animal being my korban, that animal will be my korban, and you think that your first animal will thereby become not a korban. Turns out that both are going to be korbanot. You're going to be stuck bringing both, and you have violated the prohibition of tamura, which has its whole masechet associated with it. So that's the second one. And again, that's being done with your mouth. And if you curse somebody with one of God's names, that would also subject you to lashes, even though there's no action associated with it. But hello, Rabbi Yochanan, Gufei Kamar. But it's Rabbi Yochanan who says that over there. And Hacha da'akimas fasav having ma'aseh. But here he's saying that that just the movement of a mouth constitutes an action. So what's the difference? Why over there does he say that it's not an action, and here he says that it is? Im kain nishba umeimar umakalach aver b'shem amai machshavosam lav she'ein b'maisa. Why are those considered a lav she'ein b'maisa? So Tosfos answers one answer. Now, of course, one answer that one could give, and there are other Rishonim who say this, is that, well, that was he was just telling us what Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. He wasn't saying it for himself. But Tosfos wants to answer it to be consistent and say that he was agreeing with that statement. V'yesh lomer delo kam Rabbi Yochanan dakimas piv havi ma'isa ela hacha, that only here it constitutes an action. Mishum debedibure ka'avid ma'isa, because through his words, he's causing an action to take place, right? It's either the action of muzzling or the action of leading the animals. Shaholechas v'dasha below achila, because either it's going or it's it's moving along, or it's threshing without actually eating any of the food, so therefore it's being muzzled. So that's Tosfos on that issue, and so we see that actually there is an understanding of how Rabbi Yochanan can be consistent. So okay, so now Rabbi Yochanan asks Reish Lakish a question to try and show that he is correct, but Reish Lakish will of course have an answer. Esvei Rabbi Yochanan l'Reish Lakish, as we turn to Tzadik Aleph Amud Aleph, Losha Adam Rashai Lahamir. Now, this is the middle of a Mishnah that we're picking up on. This is a Mishnah in Tamura. It's, I think, the first Mishnah in Tamura. And the Mishnah says, before this, it notes the fact that both men and women can do the action of Tamura. So when you say that one might have thought that was to say that it's permitted. So the Mishnah continues, Lo Shadam Rashayla Hamir. That's not to say that a person is allowed to engage in that substitution of one korban for another. Ela She'im Hamir Mumar V'Sofeg as Harbayim. Rather, if you did, then you will have you did an action of Mumar, and therefore you will receive 40 lashes. So the point is doesn't that show that in fact the Mishnah is showing that speaking constitutes an action? After all, you've done something and you've changed, and you're subject to, and you're being liable. So Amar Alei, Hamani Rabbi Yehuda. Reish Lakish says, no, not necessarily. That's Rabbi Yehuda. To Amar Lav She'ein Bo Ma'isa Lokin Alav. That when it comes to a lav that doesn't have any kind of action, you can get malchus, because Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the position that says that a lav she'ein bo ma'isa ein lokin. Okay, so umimatzis mukmas la Rabbi Yehuda. Well, 1 second, how can you say that Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Yehuda? V'hakatani reisha, we said at the beginning part of that Mishnah, hakol mamrim echad ha'anishim ve'echad ha'nashim, that both men and women and anyone can engage in this action of substitution. And then the Gemara, in explaining it, we explain that hakol asuyemai. Why do we say hakol? Why not just say echad hanashim, but echad hanashim, that both men and women can violate? What's hakol? So hakol asuye yoresh udulo Rabbi Yehuda. We say that everyone includes a person who inherits a korban. Even one who inherits a korban has the possibility of engaging in tamura. And that disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda. The Ika Rabbi Yehuda ha'amar yoresh eno meimir yoresh. Eno meimir yoresh eno somech. That a one who inherits has no ability to perform tamura, to engage, to substitute the korban, because he's not the one who sanctified the korban. And in addition, he doesn't. The one who inherits the animal who's been set aside as a sacrifice does not have the ability to lien on the animal. That's part of the sacrificial process, is to lien on the animal. And so as a result, we're going to say that this Mishnah can't be like Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says that an inheritor does not have the ability to perform mumar, whereas the Mishnah seems to say that you could. And so so you can't possibly answer Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, you can't give the answer that this Mishnah is according to Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Lakish clarifies, no, that the author of this Mishnah agrees with Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to that when you fail to do a lav she'ein bo ma'isa does get malchus, that even though you have no action, you will get lashes. And but he disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda with respect to the rule about inheritors not being able to do tamura, because he holds that you can do tamura. So that's not necessarily inconsistent. We can have somebody who holds two different opinions on Rabbi Yehuda's positions. So all right, so we haven't failed to bring a proof, but now the Gemara quotes a brisa, which teaches that muzzling can also lead to liability. So it's not just that you are going to be subject to lashes, but you actually may owe somebody something. Why? Well, let's take a look. If you muzzle a cow or any other animal for that matter, and you thresh with it, then you are going to receive lashes. Umishalam arba kabin lepara v'gimel kabin lechamor, and you need to pay 4 calves for the cow and 3 calves for the donkey. So what's the situation there? So we're going to Rashi implies this, but let's take a look at Rashi and we'll see the implication, which about 13 or 14 lines down in Rashi, right opposite the Hagosa Bach on the right-hand side. Gimel kavin lechamor, kach shiuro chachamim achilaso. That basically the chachamim estimate that that's how much a donkey would eat while threshing, would be 3 kav. And so the idea is that if I hire your animal stand to do my threshing, and now I muzzle it, I owe you, because part of the way you set up your rental agreement with me was the assumption that your animal would get fed. Exactly. And now I failed to do so, so I owe you for that. Well, but second, what about the principle of kimle b'derabamine? Doesn't this violate it? Because you not only do we, of course, we all know kimle b'derabamine, that you only get the most severe punishment when it comes to lashes and death. Which do you think is more strict, Mark? Lashes or death? Which do you think is death? Exactly. Death is much more strict. So you would only get the death penalty. And so, but when it comes to lashes and paying money, you would think that lashes are more strict and you would only deal with the lashes. So here we're saying that the person has to pay money and get lashes. So Amar Abaye, we're going to have 3 different answers to this question. Abaye offers the first one. Hamani Rebbe Meir he Damar Loka Umashalim. It's Rebbe Meir. Rebbe Meir says that although we say Kimle b'derabba mineh when it comes to the death penalty, but when it comes to lashes and money, we say that you can get both. Rava Amar. Rava offers answer number 2. So answer number 2 is Esnan Asra Torah Va'afilu Ba Al Imo. That, well, all right, so now this is going to take some explanation. Let's take a look at Rashi so that we know what it is. But Esnan Zona is the payment that one pays to a prostitute. That payment, if it's an animal, may not be used as a sacrifice in the Beis Hamikdash. That is based on a pasuk in the Torah. The pasuk says in Perek Kaf Gimel pasuk Yud Tet that you shall not bring a harlot's wage to the house of Hashem your God. So so here's the story. What happens if the zona that one has relationships is that person's mother? Okay, yeah, terrible. But here's the story. So now the question is, clearly we have the principle of Kimle b'derabba mineh, meaning that the person is subject to the death penalty because having relations with your mother is subject to the death penalty. So now the two of them are going to get killed. But what about that wage? If he in fact paid her the animal as her wage for prostitution, do we say that because he's not liable? Remember, if in fact she were to sue in court, he would not be liable for that money because we don't charge money for something that to be subject to the death penalty. So let's take a look and we'll see in Rashi. So now we're just above the Gilyon Ashas on the right hand side. So Rava Amar Esnan Asra Torah Afilu Ba Alimo V'Nasan La Tla. If you give a sheep the esnan as the price, esnan who it's still considered the wage of a prostitute, v'asur lekarban, and it will be prohibited as a karban. The esnan stomach sieve, because the Torah, when it says that prohibition in Perek Kaf Gimel pasuk Yutet, it's loshna imo, loshna pnuya. It doesn't make a difference who you pay the wage to, even if it's your mother. That if she were to try and sue her son in court, saying, "Listen, you promised me to pay me for my prostitution services," she would not be able to collect. Right? Come on, Tunli Esnani, and she says, "Come, give me my my wage." Lo machayvin, we wouldn't obligate him. Daha kam le because we have this principle of you only get the most severe punishment. But but if he goes ahead and he gives it to her, esnanhu, it constitutes the wage of a prostitute. Alma afil b'makom misa. Therefore, even though he's subject to the death penalty, nami ramu tashlumin alei, he does have some kind of obligation to pay her. Ela she'ein koach la'ansho b'shnayim. Just the court doesn't have the ability to punish him twice. Aval yedei shemayim. But in the eyes of heaven, or in the hands of heaven, lo yatsa ad sheyishalem. He's not going to have fulfilled his obligation until he pays her. So similarly here, although this person is subject to both lashes and paying, we don't mean that the court is going to make him liable, but rather from a heavenly perspective, the person is liable. And so that is why we would, this is not going to be subject to Kimle b'derabba mineh. Okay, so that's answer number 2. Answer number 3, Rav Papa Amar Mishas Mishicha Ichayev Lebiminizono Seha Umilka Lo Lucky Ad Shasa Chasima. That there are 2 moments in time, and when you separate the moments in time, so then you can be subject to 2 punishments, because you are liable for the animal's food as soon as you take possession of the animal from the renter. But when it comes to the muzzling, until you actually engage in that act of muzzling while the thing is threshing, you have not become liable for that. So there are two different moments of liability. So as a result, Kimle b'derabim minei does not apply. All right, having said that, so now we're going to have some teachings of Rav Papa. Just by the way, and it's interesting because these are interesting teachings, but they don't really belong here. But let's take a look and see what they've got. So actually, one of them belongs here. One of them relates to mixing of species, kalayim, which we've seen over the course of these last few days. So it's not completely out of the blue, but the main connection is that we have Rav Papa again. Amar Rav Papa, Hani Mili Bo Minai. These things were asked of me. Debay Rav Papa Bar Abba in the yeshiva of Rav Papa Bar Abba. Upshate lahu leisura, and I prohibited in both cases. Chada kehilchasa, v'chada delav kehilchasa. One time, that is the right halacha, meaning that's the strict letter of the law was to prohibit it, and one time it wasn't, meaning not that he was doing it improperly, but he was being stricter than the rule needs to be. So let's take a look and see which one is which. So Ba'imine, what was question number one? Mahu lalush es ha'isa b'chalab. What's the story with kneading with milk? Are you allowed to make dairy bread? So upshate and and I said that was prohibited. You're not allowed to make dairy milk because we are concerned, Tanya, because we have a brisa, ain lashon ha'isa b'chalav. You're not allowed to make dairy milk. The imlash kol pas kula asura.
Dairy bread. Dairy bread.
Sorry, dairy bread. Thank you. I said dairy milk, but I meant dairy bread. You're not allowed to make dairy bread because if you do, all the bread is prohibited. Because it's going to potentially make one simply accustomed to sinning. Meaning, if you have dairy bread in your freezer, you're going to see the bread in your freezer. You'll take it out, you'll toast it up, and you'll eat it with meat, and you will forget that it was dairy bread. So, kayotze bo, and now there are exceptions to dairy bread, and of course, one of the most famous exceptions is the English muffin. Thomas's English muffin, which were dairy. Now, in the end, that it's
make onions.
Yeah. Oh, really? I didn't know that Thomas has made onions. But I know about that. Okay, but English muffins, the delicious English muffins. So they there are a number of reasons why it's permitted, but the bottom line is the simplest reason is that actually the milk is a very, very small portion. So it's not like you're kneading with dairy, but the other, but you should not have it with a hamburger. Do not have it with a hamburger. That is not what I'm saying. But in any event, the point is that also it helps that it has a unique shape, so that the shape is understood that you can the shape is understood to be a shape that is subject to potentially being dairy. All right, but in any event. And similarly, not only are you not allowed to make dairy bread, kiyotzibo ain tashin as a toner ba'alya. You can't grease the oven with the fatty tail, meaning you can't make fleishik bread. Be'im tash kola pas kula sura ad yasik es tanur. Not only that, but if you grease the oven, well, you've put fleishiks in your hot oven. Now you need to kasher that oven in order to get rid of the fat. So you need to fire the oven in order to make make yourself able to make any bread whatsoever. All right, so that was question number one. And again, the answer is that milchiks and fleishiks bread are prohibited. The other question that was asked of me, what's the rule about putting two animals of different species in a pen? Now, you are not engaging in the act of facilitating their cohabitation. You are just making it possible. They may not have any relations, which would be problematic because we say that kulayim, mixing of species, is prohibited. And so in that case, Rav Papa reports that he said that it's prohibited, but it's not the strict law. How do I know? Because here's the strict law. So hold your question and then we'll get to it. Now, Shmuel is going to say first something about non-animal sexual relations, and then he'll talk about animal sexual relations. When it comes to non-animals, if the question is have you seen enough that you can testify in court that these people engage in forbidden marital relations? Well, then all you have to do is see them lying together like you would have adultery being engaged in. So that is sufficient. You don't actually have to see any kind of penetration. But when it comes to the mixing of species, you actually have to engage in the act of facilitating, as the analogy that's used here is an applicator in a tube, meaning that a paintbrush in a tube is another way to put it. So you have to actually facilitate that action in order to violate the rule. And of course, Rav Papa's question didn't involve that. Rav Papa's question involved just having them stay in the same pen together. So that's the story. Now, Maziv Rav Achadvoy Bar Ami, Rav Achadvoy Bar Ami asked the question on Shmuel's ruling. What about the following brisa? Ilu nemar behemtecha lo sarbia. If the Torah had just said, "You shall not mate your animal," Hayiti Omer lo ye'echos adam habehema b'shasha ola aleha b'zachar, that you should not hold the female animal when the male animal is attempting to have relations with her, because that is facilitating the mating of your animals. Talmud Lomar kilayim. So therefore, it says kilayim. So and so the Torah is telling us that that's only prohibited when you engage in multiple species. Lav miklal de kilayim achiza nami lo. Doesn't that show that when it comes to kilayim, even holding the animals by the horns is not allowed? Meaning you don't have to actually facilitate the paintbrush in the paint tube. You can just facilitate. You don't have to actually put the paintbrush in the paint tube. You could actually just hold the female animal. So no, that is not in fact what is meant here. My achiza hachnasa. No, the meaning of achiza, of holding, is the insertion. V'amai kari lachiza. Well, 1 second. Why are you calling it holding if you mean insertion? No, lishnam alia. We don't try unless we actually have to talk tachlis, where we're talking about the actual details. We try to be euphemistic in our language, use a nicer language, and avoid being too crass. So Amar Rav Yehuda min b'mino muter lahachis kimchol b'shvoferis. And Rav Yehuda said, when you have two animals of the same kind, you are allowed to engage in putting the applicator in the paintbrush, in the tube, the paintbrush in the tube. And actually, you might have thought that maybe you shouldn't do that because that will, be an immodest type action. My timer, why is it not considered an immodest action? Because the person is busy with work. That's his profession. When it's your profession, people have a different attitude about it. And this, of course, is used in connection with doctors as well, in any event.
Animal husbandry.
Yeah, animal husbandry. That's exactly right. But I'm saying that this theory of when one is preoccupied with work, maybe they can engage in actions that ordinarily for an average person might be considered a breach of modesty. That is also used with respect to, male doctors, for example, an OBGYN being in a doctor setting. So Masiv Rav Achadvoy Bar Ami. So again, same question that we had just a moment ago. Rav Achadvoy Bar Ami asks, Ilu Namar, what about the brisa which said that if it had said Behem Dechalo Sarbia Hayiti Omer Loa Yachos Adam Esha Behema Kadeshi Yala Ala Zachar Tamalomer Kilayim, right? So again, the Torah says that you can't hold the animal, and I might have thought it involves even animals of the same species, but thankfully it says Kilayim. So as a result, we know that it means two different species. So Kilayim Huda Aser, it's only different species that's prohibited. But what does that imply? Hamin b'mino shari, that you're allowed to do it with its own species. But umin b'mino nami achiza ein achiza in hachnasa lo. Now, I would say that based on this price, that the only thing that's permitted is the holding of the female animal to facilitate, not the actual insertion. So, isn't that a logical understanding of that brisa? And so, no, it is a logical understanding. But mayachiza, what is meant by holding hachnasa? It means insertion. But my kari lachiza, why did you call it insertion? If you meant why did you call it holding if you meant insertion? Lishna ma'alya. Again, it tries to use euphemistic language. So Amar of Ashi. Again, we had this question. The first question that Rav Papa answered was not having two animals of different species be in the same pen. Well, Rav Ashi got a similar question. Hamilsa bo minai debe Rav Nechemia Reish Galusa. So the people of the house of Reish Galusa, the head of the Galus, asked me the following question: minu mino ushe'eno mino ladir. What if you have three animals in the pen, two of which are the same species and one is different? Do we say kevan deika mine basar mine garir? Do we say that because two of them are the same, those two will be drawn together, and as a result, neither of them will engage in inappropriate relations with the other animal? Odilma afilu hakilo. Or do we say no? Even in that situation, we don't allow it. And he ruled for them to say that it's prohibited, even though that's not actually the strict letter of the law. Again, mishum pritzusa de abde, because the concern is the fact that you have immodest, inappropriate slaves working for the head of the Reish Galusa, the head of the Galus, and as a result, if they allowed this, they may come to do something much worse. Okay, so that brings us to the next Mishnah, and the next Mishnah addresses the nature of worker that allows the one to eat from the produce.
There's the Gemara here makes no nafkamina whether it's two females with one male or two males with one female.
That is correct. It did not distinguish between those two.
We were just discussing you're not allowed to put.
Although to be clear, the intention is clearly that the two animals of the same species would be male and female. Yes.
How about you put in the pen? You're not allowed to put in the pen two animals, two different species.
That's a very interesting next question.
A horse and a donkey, I believe, produced a mule.
Yeah, that is correct. But we're not allowed to make Jews are not allowed to make mules. So that
use the mule.
You're allowed to use them exactly. So the maybe what I thought you were asking is, well, what if you have two animals of both species? So meaning two animals, two horses and two donkeys. So now, do we say that therefore the animals will go after their own and everything's fine, or do we say not necessarily? So that I don't know the answer to. But I would have thought that given the fact that we didn't cover that in the Gemara, that would potentially be permitted. But in any event, it's a worth question. What I meant in this heading here is actually what is the nature of work that allows one to eat from the produce? So let's take a look. What kind of work do you have to do? Haya osa biyadav avalo biraglav avalo below biyadav afilu b'kseifo hareze ochel. That if you're working with your hands but not your feet, or your feet and not your hands, or you're working with your shoulders, all of those situations you are allowed to eat, according to the Tanna Kamma. Well, okay, so who disagrees with that? Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad sheyasa biyadav uvaragel. No, you have to work with your hands and your feet. All right, so what's the story? Why do these two differences have these different opinions? So the Gemara is going to help us. My time. What's the reason that the Tanna Kamma says that? Because it says kisabo b'karam reyecha. When you go into the vineyard of your friend, so then that's what you're allowed to eat. B'chol mai da'avid. Whatever the work is that you're doing, you're allowed to eat. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer, no, ad sheyasa biyadav uvaragel. You have to work with your hands and your feet. So why does he say that? My time of the Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. Sure, because the person who's working has to be just like the ox that's working. Mashor, because when we say that a shore is allowed to eat while it's threshing, Mashor it's threshing with both its front legs and its hind legs, so it's both its hands and its feet. So too, a worker needs to work with his hands and feet. So by Rabba bar Rav Huna. So Rabba bar Rav Huna asks on this position of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, Dashba avazin uvesar negolin Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Mahu. What's the rule, according to Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, if you use geese or chickens to thresh? Meaning, again, you're stomping on the thing in order to cause the separation, to loosen the chaff from the seed itself. And so, how do you what happens if you're using a bird to do that? Because of course birds only effectively have legs. Their wings, are not barely, one wouldn't consider their wings hands. So do we say do we say that it needs all of its power and therefore it's sufficient? Or do we say no, it would need to actually use its hands, and its hands are its wings, and it's not using them, so therefore it's a problem. So teku, no, Rabbi Rahuna's question is not answered, and we don't have an answer for it. Now, I don't think.
Well, does this suggest? I mean, I don't know. I'm making an extension here when he's talking about the avazim v'tar nagolim. Does this apply to tools? And a person can use a fork, a lift, whatever it may be, or can use a mechanical device. He's not actually using his hands, but he's using his hands to operate the machinery, which then does the threshing, right?
That's an interesting question. Yes, I would think that if you're using your hands to use the machinery, that's what we're after. Meaning that even if you do something indirectly, that would be sufficient, but it's not completely clear. You're absolutely right that that is not directly addressed in the Brisa. But the bottom line is that we paskin like the Tanakama and not like Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. So as a result, it doesn't make a difference how you're doing the work. You're allowed to eat. Now, of course, remember that the restrictions that we covered yesterday and the day before would apply, meaning you can't just eat anything. You have to eat it's only while the food is before it's finished and you're eating it in its unfinished state, as well. So, all right, but we'll get
so then the next extension would be would involve the use of a robot. So, for instance, you're not even there, but in the vicinity, but you're working from your house and you're directing this robot to do the work.
Well, then you wouldn't have anything to worry about because anything that you'd eat, you'd have to eat of your own, unless obviously if the people run and have an agreement about feeding, that's different. But if there's no agreement about feeding, we're going to see over the course of today that you don't get to eat anything you want from the person's field. You have a limited selection. And so we'll get to that in just a moment. So, but you'll see that there wouldn't be any obligation to feed somebody who's working a remote robot. So, all right. So, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Ahua, Poalim ad shelo hilchu shasi ve'erev begas ochlen anavim ve'ein shosen yayin. If you are working, if you're stepping on the grapes to create to crush them to create wine, until you go both the full length and full width of the wine press, meaning you've been once through the entire set of grapes, then all you can eat while you're working are grapes. You cannot yet have any wine. But once you go the length and the width, the gas in the press, you can eat both the grapes and you can drink the wine because now you are working with both items. And that leads us perfectly to the next Mishnah, because if you're working with figs, you can't eat grapes. If you're working with grapes, you can't eat figs. But you are allowed to say, hey, I am going to work with the grapes this afternoon, and I way prefer grapes, and grapes are way better than the thing I'm eating now, that I'm working with now. I'm going to hold off eating now, and I'll eat the grapes when I get there. That you're allowed to do. V'kulan lo amru ela b'shas malacha. And all of this, you're only allowed to eat while you're doing work. Avamashum hashev aveda lebalim amru. But the rabbi said, as a result of the concept of trying to return something to a lost lost item to the owner, the point is that Rashi says about mibnei hashev aveda lebalim shelo yivatel mimalachto v'yocha. We don't want the person to pause or work less effectively while he's eating. So as a result, the rabbi said, that you're allowed to eat while you're walking from row to row. That even though walking from row to row may not be considered working, and we'll see that in a moment, we're going to say that you're allowed to eat, so that way when you're actually working, you are going to be able to work more effectively. And similarly, you're allowed to eat it while you're on your way back from the wine press to the workers' headquarters. And when it comes to a donkey, that you're allowed to eat when she unloads. So we're going to, that Rashi says, we're going to explain it in the Gemara. Hopefully we'll get to that at the end of today. So let's go through this detail. So now, if I'm working with one grapevine, what's the law about eating from another grapevine? So, do we say that what matters is that the same species that I'm putting into the basket, that's what I'm eating, and so therefore I can eat from another grapevine? Odilma mimasha ata nosin lechilyo shall balabayas beinan v'haleka, or do you need to actually be taking it from that particular vine? So we're going to have 4 different efforts. It's really sort of 5 efforts because the last one has 2 different versions. So 5 different efforts. The first 2 are going to try to prove that you can eat from another plant. The second 2 are going to try to prove that you cannot eat. And the last one is going to go back and say that, try to again prove that you can eat from another grapevine. So the Tim Salomar Osa Begevin.
What's the question? I'm sorry. What's the question regarding with the kalim? Why is he mentioned kalim?
Well, because that's what you're doing, right? You're working in the field. You're putting grapes into the basket, and now you see that just opposite the vine that you're working on is the most beautiful grapes that you've ever seen in your life. And so you say, listen, I'm putting grapes in from this vine right here on the right side. And now I'm going to grab a grape from the left side, and I'll take that grape to eat, because who cares? I'm working with grapes and I'm eating grapes. Do we say that it matters which vine you're trying to grab the grapes from? Or do we say, no, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're doing grapes, because after all, our Mishnah said that you can only eat grapes when you're working with grapes. You can't eat figs when you're working with grapes. So that's the question. So again, 4 or 5 different efforts essentially. The Tim Salomar Osa Begefen Zel Lo Yochal Begefen Acher. If you want to tell me that you can't take from another grapevine, well, what about the following? Shor b'mechubar hechi achil. We have said that an ox is allowed to not only eat from loose produce, but they can also eat from attached produce. But if the ox is leading a wagon into which you are putting the things, the wagon, the front of the wagon where the ox is very far away from the vine that is being worked on. So there is no way that it can possibly eat from attached produce if it's going to be pulling the wagon. So as a result, it would certainly be eating from a different grapevine. So no, that's not necessarily a proof, because Amar of Shisha, Breder of Idi, Bishracha, we're talking about where it is a long vine that could extend all the way to the front of the animal. Tashma, so effort number 1 fails. Tashma haya osa b'te'enim below yochal ba'anava. Well, 1 second. doesn't the fact that we say that if you are working with figs, you can't eat grapes, which implies that not only can you not eat figs, you can't eat figs that are analogous to figs, sorry, you can't eat figs, but something that would be analogous to figs, meaning grapes that are not from that thing, from that particular vine, you could eat. The amrat oza begeven zeb eno ochel begeven acher hechi. How could you find that you're eating from, if you don't allow eating from one grapevine to another grapevine, how can you find such a case? So again, Amar Rav Shisha Brei the Ravidi b'mud where we're talking about where it's one is hanging over the other. So what we've clarified is that as long as the grapevine, the second grapevine, is right there, you would be able to eat it from it. But you cannot. But what if it's across the aisle? Are you allowed to go across the aisle in order to effectively pause in order to eat it? So Tashma, that was the first two efforts. Both of them have failed. Now we're going to say a third effort. So Tashma.
But with the first effort, didn't we say that it's the same branch? He's just eating from the
So
shore is
exactly
at
right.
one end, and he's at
Yes.
so that's not two different.
Correct. That's
two
why.
different branches.
That's why it's not a good proof to say that you. That's why it's not a proof to say that you can eat from two different branches. That's exactly that, two different vines. We just proved you can't say that we are talking about two different vines because maybe it's one long vine. That's exactly the point. And that's how we. Okay, so that was the proof. That's the counter to the proof, meaning the proof that we had is not a good proof because maybe it's talking about one long vine. So Tashma, now we're going to try and prove that you can't eat from another vine. Tashma aval monea as atzmo ad shemagia lemakom hayafos va'ochel. You can wait until you get to the good stuff and you can eat then. But one second, if you tell me that you can, that while you're working with one grapevine, you can eat from another grapevine, let him go over to the good stuff and go get it and eat that. He could eat it immediately because the statement of waiting till the good stuff applies whether it's the same produce or a different produce. So no, that's not a proof either because he can't do that because he would have to stop working. But what if he has his children or wife that are with him? They're not actually working. They just happen to come with him to the job. And so he could send them to go get the fruit for him. And so he wouldn't have to pause his work. Would we still say it or not? Can't tell. Therefore, we no proof. So Tashma v'kulam lo amru ela b'shas malacha. And we said that in the end, all of this is only allowed during the time of work. Abal b'mnei hashiv aveda lebalim amru palim ochlim bahalichasan me'omin le'omin ubchazirasan minagas. We said that they're allowed to work when going from one road to the other and when from returning home from the wine press. Svarua. Doesn't this show that we're now treating one who is walking as if they are doing work? And therefore, and it's because we're returning a loss to the owner that he's allowed to eat during this traveling. But when it comes from the Bible, he would not be allowed to eat. Alma osa begefen zeh. Doesn't that show you can't work with one grapevine and eat from another one? Because if you could, then we wouldn't need, the Torah wouldn't have to prohibit this. No, no, maybe you can eat from another grapevine. And the problem is that walking is not doing work. And that's why you wouldn't be allowed to do it. The alternative view of this last question 4b now, is no, maybe we could say, maybe we should go with the assumption, start with the assumption that walking is not working. And the reason that you can't, that you're not allowed to eat from a biblical perspective is because you're not working. But really, if you had been working, you would be allowed to eat while you were walking. So doesn't that show you can work with one grapevine and eat from another grapevine? Because as long as you're working, as long as you're walking, You're not near any grapevine. So as a result, you're not working with a grapevine. So that shows that you don't have to be working with the grapevine that you're eating from. Lo, la'olam emalach osa begefen zeh, eno ocha begefen echer. Maybe I could say that really you can't eat from another grapevine. Umahalach ka'osa ma'isudami. And walking is like doing work. And that's why we allow the person to eat between the two jobs, because it's as if they are doing work. All right, so we've had that answer. Now let's answer the question that we ended our Mishnah with, and with that we'll conclude for today. Uvachamor kishehi porekes. Well, 1 second. We said in our Mishnah that the donkey is allowed to eat while she is unloading. When she is done unloading is the implication. Kishehi porekes meheken. Well, 1 second. If she's done unloading, where is she eating from? So ema ad shetehe parekas. No, the implication is that until the unloading is completed, she can eat. And Toso says, well, what's the havamina? What would I have thought? I might have thought that the only concern with respect to animals being prevented from eating is only where the animals can readily access the food directly, such as when they're threshing or when the food is right there and available for them to eat from. So, but when it can't see it because it's on its back, maybe I would say that that doesn't apply. So the answer is no. Even when the animal has the food on its back, you're not allowed to stop it from taking something to eat. So and Tanina Lahad Tanu Rabbanan, we have a brisa, actually a Mishnah that the rabbi, I'm sorry, what we have in our Mishnah is supported by the following brisa, meaning the way we're interpreting our Mishnah is supported by the following brisa. Because what does it say? Chamor v'gamal ochlim mimasoi sha'al gabehen. That a camel and a donkey and a camel are allowed to eat from the load that's on their back, as long as the person who owns them doesn't go and give them the food directly. Meaning, if you hired a person and his donkey, he can't then take by hand from the load that he's carrying for the donkey and feed it to the donkey. He can enable the donkey's allowed to reach back and grab a bite to eat, but he can't actually formally feed them. So, all right. So now,
well, you could say that some food fell separated from the pack on the back and fell on the ground, or you could also say that there was extra food of that type still on the ground and in that area, and the donkey wasn't loaded. They didn't load the donkey with all the hay in the farm. So it's the same food and the same type of mint, and it was in front of the donkey, and he ate that.
yes, but we're talking about the unloading process. So it's unlikely that it's being unloaded. Now it could be that what is. I don't think that the donkey is allowed to eat what has been unloaded already, because then that is stuff that the donkey is finished its work with.
No,
So
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that
right,
this is
right. But I'm saying, but the what the Mishnah was saying was referring to the donkey unloading. So it's not talking about the loading process. If we're talking about the loading process, then all the cases that you were mentioning would be fine. Except, I guess you could say, of course, that it's talking about where it just fell. But the implication certainly is that we're talking about where it's grabbing the food, it's bending its neck backwards to grab some of the food that's on its back.
No, but if a person is unloading the donkey, and
Mhm.
during that process he got a bale of hay, let's say, if the donkey eats hay, and scraps of that hay they separate from the other, he's got a basket of it, and a few pieces fall down on the ground. Wouldn't the donkey be permitted to eat those?
It's not so clear to me that the donkey would be permitted to eat those, because if they're scrap pieces, so then maybe we can assume that's the case. But really, the donkey's work is done with respect to those pieces, so maybe it doesn't have the right to eat those pieces. That would be my take. It's only the food that it's still working with that it has the right to eat. So I'm not sure
But
that
it's
your
talking
comparison
about
is
ad where did it say? It said that
agitated porekis, but that
right,
doesn't tell
but
you.
it hasn't the unloading hasn't yet been completed. The Balabayit is removing it, but pieces of it, it's like paya in a sense. It's not really
Right.
paya, but pieces of the hay fall on the ground
But
during
here, let's
but the
take a look at
unloading hasn't been completed yet.
let's take a look at the last Rashi, and you'll see why I don't think that that's the again. Once it's unloaded, if it falls to the ground, that would not be permitted because again, agite porekes until it's unloaded. Third line of Rashi on Tzadik Bet Amud Aleph, behalichasa, when it's going, ocheles, it can eat mimasui sha'al gaba. Until that moment, until it's unloaded, it has the right to eat from the load that's on top of it. It does not necessarily, in my mind, have the right to eat. I'm not saying for sure. I don't know. I'm not poskening here, but it's not clear to me that we're talking about that. It seems clear that the Gemara is referring to the ability of the animal to eat what is on its back, not something else. All right, we'll
I don't know.
stop
I
there.
mean, I'm seeing that this was on the donkey's back. The unloading process was not yet complete. That you're still lifting it from the donkey. It hasn't completed yet. So in those last few seconds, few pieces fall on the ground. Why wouldn't the donkey be able to eat those?
Again, because the donkey wouldn't be able to eat those because those are not currently being worked on with by the donkey. And so as a result, since there's no current work being done by the donkey for those pieces, it's not you're not allowed to eat it. It's as if you're eating something that the donkey is just found along the way. That's not the produce that the donkey is working with. It's only the produce that the donkey is working with, and anything that's already fallen on the ground, it's no longer working with. That's the way I understand it. You can understand it a different way. I'm not
I hear what you're saying. I'm just
yeah.
thinking that let's say there are two packs on the donkey's back, whatever, the same food, and the owner hasn't finished the poreket yet, and there are a few
Right,
pieces.
but once it removes the first package, the donkey can't eat from that package any longer.
Right,
It can
but he could
only
eat
eat from
from
the package that's on its back still.
yes, the package that's on his. I don't know. It's a fine point here. Okay.
Okay, you should call. All right. All right, and like I said, as I noted in the note, to what extent does the value of the work and the value of the produce affect our discussion? So for that question, stay tuned for tomorrow's daf.